Welcome to my teacher program. Today we are going to discuss about a very important topic which is for grade 11. The basics you might have studied even in grade 10, that is respiration in organisms. So here I have written respiration in plants. So normally students are asking this doubt, do plants respire? We have a doubt, right? So what is respiration? First let us discuss what is respiration, then we will see. Okay? So respiration means it is the breaking of glucose molecule in the presence of oxygen. That is, glucose molecule is broken into similar molecules using oxygen molecules. So we have seen that in the plants there are, you might have studied the anatomy of the leaf, there are stomata. Using the stomata the gases exchange takes place through the stomata. That means we have seen that during photosynthesis carbon dioxide enter into the plant, and after the photosynthesis oxygen removed out of the plants, right? So here we have seen that even during the respiration process plants utilize oxygen. Okay, so we have seen the simplest formula for the respiration is, that is C6H12 C6H12O6 plus 6O2 gives 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus ATP molecules. So this is the simplest formula which you might have studied in the grade 10. So we have seen that glucose molecule is getting oxidized and carbon dioxide and water molecule is released. Okay. So now those are watching, please listen carefully that the respiration process taking place not only in plants, it takes place even in animals. So in animals we may get confused between the respiration and breathing process. Breathing is also a part of respiration. Then what is the difference between breathing and respiration in animals? That is, we have seen that the physical process of taking in of oxygen and giving out of carbon dioxide, this physical process is known as breathing process. So here we have seen that there are many organs related to the breathing. These organs together we call it as respiratory system. That is, we have taking the oxygen through the nostrils. That is, we can say that we are not only taking the oxygen, that is, we are taking the air which contain more amount of oxygen, and this oxygen, that is, for example, you can see that through the nostrils we are taking the oxygen which reaches on the lungs. This air reaches into the lungs, and what happens to this air? This air which contain more amount of oxygen will enter into the capillaries, blood capillaries. That means we have seen the exchange of gases taking place inside the lungs, exactly speaking inside the alveoli of the lungs, and the capillaries which contain the oxygenated blood takes this blood into the tissues. Now in the tissues what is happening? There we can see the chemical process taking place. This chemical process of respiration is also known as cellular respiration. Cellular respiration. So hope this is clear to you. That is, we are taking the air which contain more amount of oxygen into the body, and this air passing through the nostrils, trachea, then bronchi, and reaches into the lungs, and from the lungs, that means from the alveoli chambers of the lungs, it enters into the capillaries where the exchange of gases taking place, and this blood which is oxygenated will be taken into the tissues, where inside the tissues chemical process taking place. This process is known as cellular respiration. Similarly, we have seen even in the plants respiration taking place inside the cells. Plants can takes the air through the stomata as well as through the lenticels. You might have studied the structure of lenticels as well as the stomata. So normally plants takes air through the stomata, and this air is used for the respiration process. Now let us see what are the different stages in respiration. That is, we have seen that there are mainly two types of respiration. We can see the two types of respiration. One is known as that is the aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. This all parts very easy. Now we will see what is aerobic respiration. As the term indicates, the respiration which takes place only in the presence of oxygen. Anaerobic respiration in the absence of oxygen. So in the absence of oxygen, where does the respiration takes place? That is, for example, in case of yeast you have studied anaerobic respiration taking place in yeast. How does the anaerobic respiration taking place in yeast? For what we are using yeast? Yeast we are using for fermentation process. We are using yeast for fermentation process. So during this fermentation, what is happening here is the glucose molecule will be converted into ethyl alcohol molecule. Glucose molecule is converted into ethyl alcohol molecule. So this is what happening in the case of fermentation. Now anaerobic respiration you can see even in the muscle cells. That is, if you are doing a strenuous exercise or the hard work, we can see that muscle cells gets pain, or we may not able to contract the muscles. So how this is happening? This is happening because instead of the muscle cells undergoing the complete aerobic respiration, it undergoes the anaerobic respiration, and as a result glucose will be converted into lactic acid. So here we can see that the lactic acid will be accumulated in our tissues. So there are two types of anaerobic processes which I have explained now. That is, one in the case of yeast. What is yeast? Yeast is a fungus, unicellular fungus. In the yeast we can see that glucose will be converted into ethyl alcohol. Then in case of muscle cells, in the absence of oxygen, suppose we are doing the strenuous exercise or the contraction and relaxation of the muscles, we can see that the glucose will be converted into lactic acid, and this lactic acid will be stored in the muscle, which leads to the pain. Now let us see what are the main steps of these aerobic and anaerobic respiration. As I mentioned, aerobic as well as anaerobic respiration, the first step remains same, that is glycolysis. As the term indicates, glycolysis means the lysis or the breaking of glucose molecule. That is, in the first step we can see that the glucose molecule is broken into two similar molecules. This process is known as glycolysis. Let us see here the various steps of glycolysis. Glucose is converted into glucose 6-phosphate. Glucose converted into glucose 6-phosphate, and glucose 6-phosphate is converted into fructose 6-phosphate. Sorry, it's only an isomerization. Glucose is converted into glucose 6-phosphate, and glucose 6-phosphate is converted into fructose 6-phosphate. Now let us see here how does this conversion taking place. We can see that the glucose molecule, first we are starting with the glucose molecule. This glucose molecule is converted into glucose 6-phosphate. Here you can see that the phosphate group is attached on the 6th carbon of the glucose molecule. So from where does this phosphate group has come? The phosphate has come from by utilizing ATP molecule to ADP molecule. Hope you know what is ATP and ADP molecules. ATP molecules are the adenosine triphosphate molecules. Adenosine triphosphate, that is, we can see the one adenine molecule, then adenosine. When we say adenosine, it is sugar molecule and triphosphate molecule, 3-phosphate group. This is what the ATP molecule, adenine plus sugar molecule plus 3-phosphate molecules together forms the ATP molecule. Now, this ATP molecule is used, or we can say that ATP molecule is broken into ADP and inorganic phosphate. ATP is broken into ADP and inorganic phosphate molecule. Now, this inorganic phosphate molecule will be added with the glucose molecule. In the glucose molecule, why this is written 6-phosphate? It does not mean that there are 6 phosphate groups. It means the phosphate group is attached on the 6th carbon of the glucose molecule. That is, if you are writing the glucose molecule, you can see that there are 6 carbons. Plus here we can see that this is the 6th carbon where what is attached, the phosphate group is attached. So, glucose is converted into glucose 6-phosphate. Now, what is happening to this glucose 6-phosphate? Glucose 6-phosphate is again converted into fructose 6-phosphate. Here only the change is glucose became fructose. Now, you should know what is the difference between glucose and fructose, which I have mentioned earlier. Glucose contain the aldehyde group and fructose contain the ketone group. The ketone group is present in fructose molecule. Now, again we can see that fructose, this molecule is converted into fructose 1,6-diphosphate molecule. So, fructose 1,6-diphosphate molecule. So, here again we can see one more phosphate group is added. So, where does this glycolysis process taking place? The glycolysis process taking place inside the cell, of course inside the cell, inside the cytoplasm, or we can say exactly the cytosol. Glycolysis, which is the common step for both aerobic as well as anaerobic respiration, which is taking place in the cytosol of the cell. Now, let us see the various steps of glycolysis. Glucose 6-phosphate converted into fructose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-diphosphate. Then we can see the here the fructose 1,6-phosphate is broken. That is, 2 molecules are formed, each with 3 carbon compounds. Now, we will start with the fructose 1,6-diphosphate, fructose 1,6-diphosphate. So, you can see that here how many carbon molecules are there? Here 6 carbon molecules and 2 phosphate molecules. This fructose 1,6-diphosphate has 6 carbon and 2 phosphate molecule, and this will be broken into 2 molecules. So, how many carbon will be there in each molecules? That is, each molecule will be having 3 carbon and 1 phosphate. 3 carbon and 1 phosphate. So, fructose 1,6-diphosphate, which is a hexose with a diphosphate, is broken into 2 molecules, each containing 3 carbon and 1 phosphate. That is, which are these molecules? These molecules are glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxy acetone phosphate. Now, we will come back after a short break.